Welcome back to State of Valor. She had survived enemy fire in 4 countries. She had completed missions that will never appear in any official record. She had buried her husband in November rain, raised his daughter completely alone, and never once asked the world for anything in return. But on the night of the worst storm in 10 years, Commander Elena Hayes sat in a dark and silent cabin at the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains and did the one thing her entire military career had never prepared her for. She waited, and she was absolutely terrified. The storm outside was violent and relentless. Thunder rolled through the dark valleys like cannon fire. Rain hammered the roof of the small wooden cabin in waves, and the old oak trees beyond the window bent sideways in the wind, their last autumn leaves tearing away and disappearing into the black. The single lamp on the kitchen table threw a weak circle of yellow light across the floor, and inside that circle, Elena sat completely still, both hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she had not touched in over an hour. Her daughter had been missing for 48 hours. Her name was Irene. She was 5 years old, small for her age, with her father's serious dark eyes and a laugh that filled every room she walked into. She had a habit of collecting smooth stones from the creek behind the cabin and lining them up on the porch railing in order of size. She talked to birds. She believed completely that if you whispered a wish into a closed fist and then opened your hand slowly toward the sky, something somewhere would hear it. She had vanished from the tree line at the edge of their property the previous afternoon, while Elena was carrying firewood from the back porch. Elena had looked up, and Irene had been standing at the trees in her yellow rain boots and her small red jacket. Elena had looked down for 30 seconds. When she looked up again, the tree line was empty. The forest had simply taken her. Search teams had come within the hour. Deputies and volunteers and 2 tracking dogs from the county sheriff's department had worked the mountain trails until past midnight, calling Irene's name into the dark until their voices gave out. Elena had walked every step beside them, refusing to stay behind, her flashlight cutting through the rain while the storm built steadily around them all. But by midnight, the trails were rivers of mud. A mudslide had crossed the eastern path and buried the ground under 2 feet of wet earth. The tracking dogs had lost the scent completely. The sheriff, a quiet and decent man named Dale Cooper, had walked up to Elena with his hat in his hands and rain running down his weathered face. He had not needed to speak. She already knew. "Elena," he said softly, "we have to pull back until morning. The moment this rain breaks, every one of us will be back on that mountain. You have my word." She had nodded once and walked back to the cabin alone. That had been 4 hours ago. Now she sat at the kitchen table in the silence and the lamplight and pressed the fingers of her right hand against the silver chain around her neck. The chain held 2 things, her military dog tags and a plain gold wedding band, thin and simple, the kind a young soldier buys when he is 26 years old and so deeply in love that nothing else in the world seems to matter at all. Her husband's wedding ring. His name had been Captain James Hayes, Army Special Forces, a quiet and deeply serious man who smiled rarely and laughed fully and loved his family with a ferocity that sometimes took Elena's breath away even now, 3 years after she had watched them fold his flag. He had been killed during a classified mission overseas on a Tuesday in November. The kind of mission that does not make the news and is never discussed at official ceremonies. The kind that leaves a family with a folded flag and a silence that never completely fills. James had not died alone. Beside him, until the very last moment, had been his military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger. 4 years they had served together, 2 deployments, every training day, every operation, every quiet morning at the kennel before the rest of the base woke up. James had spoken about Ranger the way some men speak about a brother, with a steady and private pride that needed very few words, because words were never entirely sufficient. Ranger had been killed in the same moment as James, holding his position, covering his handler until there was nothing left to give. They had been buried with full honors, 3 days apart, in the same cold week of November. Elena had stood at attention at both services, with 2-year-old Irene on her hip, because standing at attention was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else had been taken. She had raised Irene alone in Whisper Valley after that. The small mountain town had been James's idea, a place to come home to someday, a place with clean air and quiet mornings. Elena had stayed because leaving felt like losing him a second time. Irene had grown up knowing her father only through photographs and bedtime stories. She asked about him often. She asked where heaven was, and whether her daddy could see her, and whether he was proud of her for learning to read. And sometimes, with great seriousness and great care, she wrote him letters, small, careful letters in purple crayon on notebook paper, folded into uneven squares, the way only a child folds something truly private, something meant for one person and no one else. Elena kept every single one of them in the wooden box on the top shelf of her closet, beside James's service photograph and his folded flag. She whispered now into the empty kitchen, into the noise of the storm. "I already lost him. Please, she is all I have left of him. Please do not take her too." The storm answered with thunder that shook the window panes in their frames. And then, beneath the thunder, beneath the hammering of rain against the roof, she heard something else. Something small, something that did not belong to the storm at all. Tap. Elena opened her eyes. Tap. Tap. It was coming from the window beside the front door, not the heavy random percussion of rain against glass, something lighter than that. Something deliberate, with a pause between each sound, as though whatever was making it was patiently waiting to be heard. Elena rose from the table. She moved into the front hallway, and she stopped. Standing on the porch, pressed close to the glass, with rain pouring off its back in silver sheets, was a dog. A young German shepherd, gray and white, completely soaked, with pale, steady eyes that caught the lamplight and held it like 2 quiet flames. The dog was not barking, it was not scratching or cowering, it was standing perfectly still in the full force of the storm, looking directly through the glass at her. And as Elena stood frozen, the dog lifted its right front paw slowly and pressed it flat against the glass. Tap. Elena had spent 12 years alongside military working dogs. She knew their language, the way she knew the language of weapons and maps and hand signals in the dark. She knew the difference between a dog that was lost and a dog that was working. This dog was working. That signal, one paw pressed flat and deliberate against the glass, was a trained military contact signal. The same signal she had watched Ranger use 100 times during training exercises when he needed James to stop moving and pay full attention. It meant one thing only: follow me. Elena did not think. She grabbed her flashlight, pulled on her boots, pushed into her jacket, and opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall, and the rain drove hard across the porch, and the forest beyond the yard was an absolute wall of black. The dog stepped back and looked up at her. Then it turned its head toward the forest. Then it looked back at her again. "Okay," Elena said quietly. "Show me." The mountain was brutal. Rain had turned every trail into a muddy river, and the roots beneath her boots were slick and treacherous in the dark. She fell twice, cutting her palm on a sharp rock and barely noticing. Branches tore at her face, and her jacket was soaked through within 20 minutes, and the cold settled deep into her hands and her lungs. But the dog never stopped. Every 20 yards it paused and looked back, those pale eyes finding hers in the beam of her flashlight, holding steady for just a moment. Then it moved again, patient, focused, certain of where it was going. Elena followed. 15 minutes into the climb, they reached a wide, flat clearing near the upper ridge. At the far edge stood the dark ruins of an abandoned lumber mill, its walls rotted and its roof half collapsed, hidden among the trees as though the forest had been slowly reclaiming it for years. Elena swept her flashlight across the ground. The beam caught something snagged on the thorns of a low bush at the clearing's edge, small and yellow and soaked through. Elena's glove. The left one, from the pair Elena had put on her hands yesterday morning while Irene complained that the fingers were too long. Elena dropped to one knee and pressed it against her face with shaking hands. A beam of light hit her directly in the eyes. She was on her feet in an instant, flashlight raised, body angled sideways out of pure reflex, every trained instinct firing at once. "Easy," a voice from the darkness, low and steady. "We are not a threat. Stand down." 3 men stepped from the shadows at the edge of the mill, heavily bearded, worn outdoor gear, watching her with the careful measuring stillness of people who had spent years being extremely alert. The man in front was tall, gray at the temples, and carried himself with the unmistakable quiet bearing of someone who had once held serious military rank. His eyes moved from the dog at Elena's side to the dog tags visible at her collar. Something shifted in his face. "She is safe," he said. "She is inside. She has been with us since early evening. Come with me right now." His name was Sergeant First Class David Mercer, retired. The men around him were also veterans, part of a small hidden community that had built itself quietly in the ruins of the old mill over several years. Men who had come back from war carrying wounds that did not show on the outside. Men living with memories and pain that the world outside had not known how to hold. They had withdrawn from ordinary life not out of weakness, but out of a desperate need for silence and for the company of others who understood without requiring explanation. David led Elena through the low doorway of the main shelter, and she stopped moving entirely. Irene was sitting on a folded blanket near a small camp stove, wrapped in an oversized army jacket that fell past her knees, her injured ankle wrapped carefully in clean bandaging, a cup of warm broth in both small hands. 2 veterans sat nearby, not crowding her, just present. One was quietly whittling a piece of wood, the other had fallen asleep sitting against the wall. Irene looked up. Her dark eyes went wide. "Mommy!" Elena crossed the shelter in 4 steps and dropped to her knees on the hard ground and pulled her daughter into her arms and held her with everything she had. She pressed her face into Irene's hair, which smelled of wood smoke and rain, and she felt the small, warm, solid weight of her, and she shook once, deeply, the way a person shakes when the thing they feared most has been handed back to them. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you, baby. I've got you." "I'm sorry, Mommy," Irene said into her shoulder. "I didn't mean to get so lost." I know you didn't." Elena pulled back just enough to look at her face, checking her eyes, her color, her breathing. "Does your ankle hurt?" "A little bit. The men fixed it." Irene glanced over at the veterans with the grave seriousness of a child delivering an important status report. One of them cried a little, but he said he had something in his eye. Across the shelter, a broad man with a thick red beard looked carefully at the floor and cleared his throat. David crouched beside Elena and told her quietly what had happened.
Irene had been found near the ravine on the eastern slope just before dark, sitting in the rain with a folded piece of paper in her hands. A few inches further, and the ravine's edge would have given way beneath her. When the veterans had asked why she had come so far into the forest alone in a storm, Irene had explained it with complete and simple seriousness. She had seen a Luna moth at the tree line behind the cabin, large and pale green and glowing softly in the late afternoon light, drifting slowly toward the forest. In Irene's world, Luna moths were messengers. She had read it in a library book and decided with total certainty that it was true. They traveled between this world and the next. They carried things between the living and the ones who had gone ahead.
She had been chasing it with a letter in her hand, a letter to her father. David reached into his jacket and held out a folded square of notebook paper, soft with rain, the purple crayon bleeding at the edges. Elena took it with both hands and opened it slowly. The handwriting was careful and uneven, each letter formed with enormous effort and concentration. Dear Daddy, I am good. Mommy is good, but she misses you a lot. I lost my tooth. I hope heaven is warm. I love you so much. Please watch over us. Love, Irene. The shelter went completely quiet around her. The camp stove ticked softly with heat. Rain moved steadily across the roof overhead. Ghost lay on the ground nearby with his chin resting on his front paws, watching Elena with his calm, pale eyes. The red-bearded man pressed the back of his face against his face. He was not the only one. Elena folded the letter very carefully and held it against her chest and closed her eyes. She did not speak for a long moment. There are no words adequate for what a mother feels when she reads her 5-year-old daughter's letter to a father who died before that daughter could truly know him. There is only silence and the kind of love that has no bottom. David told her the last thing quietly. The dog's name was Ghost. He had appeared at the edge of their mountain camp 4 months ago, half-starved and silent, with no collar and no explanation. He had simply arrived one morning and stayed. Over the weeks he had become part of the camp, moving quietly among the men, sitting beside whoever seemed to be carrying the heaviest weight that day, steady and present and asking nothing. In 4 months, he had never once left the camp boundary, not for any reason, until tonight. David had been standing at the clearing's edge when the storm broke. He had watched Ghost come suddenly awake from a dead sleep, raise his head and turn it toward the valley far below. The dog had stood, walked to the perimeter, and looked back at David once with those level, certain eyes. Then he had walked into the storm alone and disappeared into the dark. 2 hours later, he came back through the tree line, with Elena behind him. David looked at her carefully when he finished. He was a man who had seen enough of the world to be deeply skeptical of things he could not explain, but he was also honest enough to recognize when an explanation was simply not available. That dog, he said quietly, went into that storm for one reason, because your little girl asked him to. Elena looked at Irene, asleep now against her shoulder with the total and absolute trust of a child who has been found. She looked at Ghost, and she thought about James, about Ranger, about a dog who had stayed at his handler's side until there was nothing left to give, because loyalty does not calculate the cost before it acts, because some bonds are simply not built with an exit. She did not say what she was thinking. Some things are already understood. They came down the mountain the next morning when the storm had passed and the trails were quiet and the Smoky Mountains were silver and clean in the early light. Elena carried Irene on her back, and Irene slept against her shoulder with one small hand curled into the collar of her jacket. Ghost walked at Elena's left side the entire way down, not ahead, not behind, beside her, steady and close and certain, his pale eyes on the trail, his presence as calm and as solid as anything Elena had ever walked beside in her life. When they reached the cabin and she laid Irene gently on the couch and turned around, Ghost was in the open doorway. He looked at Irene for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena. "Come in," she said softly. He crossed the floor and lay down at the foot of the couch. He put his chin on his paws and he closed his eyes. His mission was finished. There are things in this world that no amount of training can explain. Moments when loyalty moves faster than reason, when love finds a way through darkness that has no map and no trail and no guarantee of return. Elena Hayes had spent 12 years learning to survive the worst the world could place in front of her. She had been taught to plan and to push and to endure, and she had learned those lessons well. But on the night of that storm, what brought her daughter home was not tactics. It was a dog who heard a little girl's whisper and decided that some things matter more than safety. Some bonds do not end when the person holding them is gone. Some loyalties travel further than any of us can know or measure or explain. James Hayes had loved two things in this world with everything he had: his family and the dog who ran beside him. Maybe that is explanation enough. Maybe that is more than enough. If this story moved something deep inside you, please share it with someone you love. Share it with someone who has served this country. Share it with someone who has lost someone. Share it with anyone who still believes that courage does not only live on the battlefield, that sometimes it walks quietly through a storm on four legs, guided by nothing in this world but love. Here at State of Valor, we tell these stories because they deserve to be told. Because the men and women who wore this nation's uniform and the animals who served faithfully beside them carried a weight that most of us will never fully understand. And the very least we can do is remember them, honor them, and make sure their stories are never forgotten. If you are new here, please subscribe and become part of this family. Every story on this channel is for you, for the Americans who still believe in sacrifice, in loyalty, and in the kind of love that does not know how to stop. And if you are a veteran watching this tonight, know this with absolute certainty: you are not forgotten. The brotherhood you built in those years of service never truly leaves you. It travels with you. It watches over you. Some soldiers protect us in life, and sometimes even after they are gone, they still find a way to send their guardians through the storm, to watch over the ones they love. State of Valor, honoring the brave, always.